welcome to the discussion. And maybe you would like to begin by just giving us a sort of feel for the book and where do you think this the debate on the Indo-Pacific is going forward.
Look, thank you, Indrani. So look, it's a great opportunity to introduce my new book to friends and colleagues in India and I guess elsewhere in the world who might be joining into this session. It's obviously a pretty confronting time to be talking about the big strategic challenges of the region. But in some ways, I'd like to think that the book that I'm going to be speaking about today helps to set the scene for the strategic challenge and opportunity, not only for India, for Australia, for a range of other powers that are not only the United States or China, the only two countries we often seem to hear about. So look, let me just begin with a few opening thoughts, Indrani, and perhaps when Harsh is back, he can join us in the conversation. Look, the topic of the book, and I'm just going to share with the participants and viewers what we're talking about here today. So my new book, which comes in two covers and two editions, but the international edition is called Indo-Pacific Empire. And interestingly, the publisher decided they needed the word America in the title. So it's China, America, and the contest for the world's pivotal region. But the original Australian edition, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future, was published in Australia last month, and the international edition's being rolled out around the world now. The book distills, I think, a lot of the arguments that I and others have been developing in recent years about the Indo-Pacific, and some of those are going to be very familiar to you, Indrani, and to others in Delhi. But the short of it is, I guess, to introduce a wider range of readers and policy thinkers to this, what is now, I think, a more and more orthodox conception of our region, but what until recently was quite unusual, even radical. And I'm going to pause on this point because I think Harsh is back with us. Right. But the whole point of this conversation, I think, is to talk about how powers like India and Australia can work multipolarity to our advantage. And I know Harsh is doing a great job, but technology is letting him down. So, look, as I was saying, and I think Harsh was alluding to as well, the book attempts to take a very big picture, broad brush approach at one level to this Indo-Pacific idea that has been, I think, framing foreign policy, certainly for Australia, and I think certainly also for India in recent years. So at one level, this is a history book, and perhaps that's just as well, because with the rapid changes in the region, I think, as I say in the introduction to the book, anything you write about the near future is a gift to fate, and fate is going to keep taking that gift and surprising you. But I make the argument that, in fact, there's been a very long arc of regional history, a somewhat submerged regional history of our shared maritime region, and that in a sense, the Indo-Pacific idea, it's not actually as new as many of us suspected. And I think there are many in India who realised it wasn't new. The book makes a strong argument that there is, particularly since the 1940s, a submerged Indian current, if you like, in the Indo-Pacific idea. But also that this long view of our region's history actually gives us a foundation for multipolar solidarity in managing Chinese power, because the book argues this was a region where China was always prominent, or not always prominent, but mostly prominent, but never dominant across the broader region. And so the myth making, the fake news or the fake olds, if you like, of the Belt and Road, the idea that China has some natural centrality to a much larger maritime Asian-centric region is simply not true, and the book makes that case. I might, if I may, Indrani, I might jump into the thesis of the book a little bit more before. What I'd like to do is get to the so what for our policymakers, and of course, I'm sure in the discussion section, our participants are going to want to talk about what happens next, including in the COVID context.
That's right. Please do so. I mean, that would be actually very useful.
I'll do that and hope to see Harsh again. So I will inflict a few maps, if you don't mind, on the audience, because the book is partly about maps and about how mental maps help policymakers really reimagine the region, and I think take quite bold steps in policy. And I'd say, from an Indian context, certainly the speech that we heard Prime Minister Modi give in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue several years ago was a real marker for India there. So let's jump into the map. So I'm going to share my screen here and go straight to a few slides just to share with viewers, and I assume you can all see this now, how this Indo-Pacific idea works in a practical sense and in terms of a regional vision to help our countries make foreign and security and indeed geoeconomic policy. So this first, I've got about 10 maps I'll quickly skim through. This first frame is a version of the official Australian government concept of the Indo-Pacific. The Australian government 7 years ago, round about the time that I was first interested in this idea, released a defence white paper that focused on the sea lanes of communication, of energy, of trade that unite and bind our region, and then I think certainly put India and Australia in the same strategic frame. And so this, if you like, is the contemporary Indo-Pacific. We're all pretty familiar with this now, the unity of those sea lanes, the connectivity, bringing South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Australasia and North America all together in the one frame and extending over to Africa, the Middle East and beyond. What's interesting though is that as I got researching this, and of course a lot of my thinking in this space began, I hate to say it now, my beard is getting a bit grey, but 20 years ago when I was first posted to the Australian High Commission in New Delhi, and I was looking for those, I guess, hidden currents of convergence of interest between Australia and India. The research actually takes us back a long way. And so if you start looking at the conceptions mentally and in maps of an Asia-centric region, but a region that is not purely Asia, throughout history, there's an extraordinary pattern that you see. So you go from this contemporary vision right back to this map from Korea in 1402, that captured in an idea of the world as seen by East Asia and Europe at the same time, because this map was a combination of East Asian and European ideas of the world. And in fact, that enormous mass in the middle of the map is, of course, a combination of essentially India and China, South Asia and continental East Asia. Quite central, but if you note the emphasis on the coastlines, so many of the settlements are around the coastlines, the archipelago of Southeast Asia, Africa's over there with a rather interestingly shaped lake in the middle of it. This was a single frame of the world as perceived 600 or more years ago. And so even then, what we imagine as Asia was essentially, in my view, more of a maritime region than a continental region. The maritime and the continent mattered most where they, I guess, touched one another in the ports. And this has a bearing on, of course, the current Indo-Pacific debate over port infrastructure. And then you see throughout subsequent history, the European colonial era, the idea of maritime Asia that dominated really right through until the 20th century, was again this single frame, this Indo-Pacific frame. This particular map from 1571, one of the first vaguely authentic, or I should say vaguely accurate, European maps of the region by Ortelius, the Dutch map maker, captures again India, Southeast Asia, North Asia, North America, and even if you look in the bottom corner, Australia, with the intriguing word beach there. They knew something about Australia even then, all in the one frame. And interestingly, again, although there may be mermaids and sea monsters, which, yes, they're mythical, but then so is the 9-dash line. Interestingly, this map accentuated the maritime region, a connected maritime region, as essentially a single strategic and economic system. The book goes further, I guess, back into history, and I don't have maps to illustrate that, but the book also takes us back to the pre-modern period, to the ancient period, to, I guess, India's maritime empires, to, of course, the Southeast Asian civilizations heavily influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism, India's cultural exports, and makes the point that really, really throughout history, the most recurring thread has been, hello, Harsh, I take it you're back. I'll pause for you in a moment. The recurring thread has been connectivity across this vast maritime space. I might pause there, and I'd like to jump to the present day in a moment. But Harsh, I wonder if you wanted to reframe a little. I've started a journey through the many maps in the book, and I guess their relevance to the present day.
No, I'm extremely sorry, Rory, for this, but I think maybe you can continue your conversation, and I'll come back at the end and then do an overview.
That sounds good. So I'm in full flight. So I was just talking about the myths and the map making and the 9-dash line and its interesting parallel with mermaids. But let's jump to the present. So there was this I guess pattern of connectivity, of culture, of trade, of some degree of political and even strategic contact between the different sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific, going right back to ancient times, even to before recorded history. And throughout the colonial era, and of course colonialism both broke the region and broke the connections between the many Asian civilizations in the region, but also connected the region to a global system at the same time in patterns that we still see today. Throughout that colonial period, again, the typical concept of Asia was a single frame, a region where really maritime connectivity was dominant. This particular French map or Australian maps that you see from the 17th and the 19th centuries. And it really wasn't, I argue, and my research argues, until the middle of the 20th century that a lot of these actually more artificial ideas about the region, particularly the idea of the Asia-Pacific, were created for important political purposes of their time, but their days were numbered. And interestingly, the book even draws parallels between some of these old European colonial conceptions of the region and I guess China's ambitions for the region, the Belt and Road. And there's a particular map that we'll come back to perhaps later in the conversation, the contemporary Chinese map in this frame, which we see in more detail here, that I think captures very starkly, very powerfully Chinese strategic ambition and the use of mental maps as kind of strategic wish-making, if you like, an idea of how China wants to perceive the world and the region that it wants to dominate. And of course, as we see here, America is essentially bisected and cast to the outer darkness of the globe. All this map talk is kind of erudite and historically interesting, but I want to jump to the core theme of the book in a moment and begin the discussion about the present day, just by again bringing viewers' attention to the parallels between all of these visions throughout history, going right back to essentially medieval times, the colonial era, the post-colonial era, because of course a lot of the Pan-Asian resistance to European colonialism, the links between India and Southeast Asia and Japan and China indeed, were in their sense Pan-Asian and to some extent Indo-Pacific in character. But then to the present day, where we're beginning to see a return, and the book argues we're seeing a return of the Indo-Pacific rather than a brand new conception of the region as a single strategic system, bringing together East Asia, South Asia, the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. And this is where we get to, I guess, the heart of the story, the China dimension. The book opens with an account of particularly the diplomacy between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe of Japan several years ago, where India and Japan heavily influenced one another in devising their own Indo-Pacific viewpoints. The idea that particularly as their own interests and China's interests and activity expanded across this large two-ocean strategic space, it made very, very good sense for India and Japan to join forces to the extent that they could, to find solidarity with one another and with others such as Australia, and importantly, to work as Japan has done to influence the United States to see the region more in this light. And although, as the book notes, it's been the Chinese leadership, so for example, Chinese foreign minister has dismissed the Indo-Pacific as an idea that I guess is an attention-grabbing idea that will dissipate like ocean foam, I think is what he said. At the same time, that's because China perceives risk in this very idea of the Indo-Pacific, this idea that because the region is a large strategic system, therefore countries in different parts of the region, such as Japan, India, Australia, Indonesia, United States, perhaps even some of our European friends like the French, who are resident powers here, that these countries can essentially find common cause in managing and limiting and establishing, I guess, principled limits to Chinese power. It's not containment, but of course the Chinese like to call it that. The irony is, as the book argues, that although China claims to reject the Indo-Pacific idea, it's actually China's own behaviour and interests and actions. Look at the Belt and Road, look at the activities of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean, look at the military base at Djibouti, look at China's attempts to exert influence through Pakistan and others in the region. China is the most Indo-Pacific of powers. And so the book concludes by looking at, again, the connectivity of the region, the idea that both, I guess, cooperation, but also risk, contagion indeed, can spread rapidly in this region. And although the book doesn't dwell at length on pandemics, I went to print on the 8th of January, nonetheless, the book does look at black swan events that could really cascade throughout this region. I conclude with the argument, and I'll jump out of the maps there if you like. I will conclude with the argument that, excuse me a moment, I conclude with the argument that to manage Chinese power in this vast region, this Indo-Pacific region, where China's interests and activity has expanded so rapidly over the past really 20, 27 years, dating back to when China became a net oil importer in 1993, there is agency for middle players, that is countries that are not the United States or China. There is potential for solidarity, and the starting point for that is really a recognition of our shared interests in this common strategic space. And so the book, I guess the more controversial subtitle of the book, Why China Won't Map the Future, the book is not about Chinese collapsism. It's not about the idea that China is doomed. I think it is about the idea that the PRC spends a lot of money and time and effort looking stronger than perhaps it actually is on the inside. The argument makes that China is not learning the lessons of empires past and is at serious risk of overreach, of overstretch across this Indo-Pacific over the next 10, 20, 25 years. The challenge for us, and this is where I'd love to perhaps get to the discussion, the challenge for the rest of us is to have a certain degree of staying power, a certain degree of solidarity, and to learn how we can set limits to Chinese power in this region, but actually, I guess, you know, in an unusual kind of way, help China to find a settling point, point before its overreach and hubris brings another, I guess, crisis to the region. Now, there's plenty more to talk about. There's obviously the whole question of how COVID will shake things up, but I hope that provides you all with a starting point and a tantalising introduction to the book.
Thank you, Rory. And again, apologies for me flitting around in and out. But I would also, for those who are joining us online, can I just suggest that they can ask questions using the Q&A tab here on their screen. So please feel free to send in your questions. I will be happy to put them across to both, if they are for Rory, if they are for Indrani, who will come next, who will be talking about her impressions of the book. But I don't know if if Indrani managed to introduce Rory a bit. But let me introduce Rory. He's a great friend, but also I think one of the most important voices when it comes to Asian security affairs. Writing for a long time, he has had a varied career from as a think tanker, as an academic, as a policy analyst for the government. And both Australian diplomat, Australian intelligence analyst. So he has seen it all, done it all, and therefore when he writes, we should take him very, very seriously. And I hope that all of you will manage to get a hold of the book. As I was saying, there are two versions of the book. One has been published in Australia as Contest for the Indo-Pacific, which Rory mentioned is more controversial title, Why China Won't Map the World. There is a Manchester University Press version, which is Indo-Pacific Empire, China, America, and the Contest for the World's Pivotal Region. And I think what is most interesting to me is how the genealogy almost of the Indo-Pacific concept has been traced here in the book using a very reader-friendly format. So we don't have to really it is not academically heavy in a sense some academic books can be. At the same time, conveying in a very interesting manner almost all the important aspects of where the term came from. Going back as far as 1850 perhaps, and talking of different disciplines, and then coming to the contemporary context. We are looking at what is happening to the strategic mapping today. And I would have some more things to say, but let me invite Indrani for her comments, and again ask those who want to have their questions, comments, please use the Q&A tab on your screens. Indrani.
Thank you. Thanks, Harsh. Thank you, Rory. That was actually fabulous. I enjoyed skimming through the book, which is what I got time to do. And one of the things that sort of stayed with me was your reference to the movements of the fish. And in a sense, sort of the region as a place for mapping the region through how fish moved. Let me tell you, as a Bengali, that speaks to me. But but no, to go back to the question of the Indo-Pacific, I have been following the idea of the Indo-Pacific since both 2007 and when Shinzo Abe actually spoke to the Indian Parliament about the confluence of two seas. And the idea, I think, germinated then, and sort of as happens between democracies, in my view, it takes a very, very long germination period, including a break of several years, so when we didn't actually take the idea forward. By the time the democracies of the region picked up on the idea of the Indo-Pacific, a sort of a rebadged concept of both cooperation and power relations in the Asia-Pacific region, I think China's actions both on the 9-dash line and everywhere else in South Asia, including its aggressiveness on the BRI, made it almost imperative for other democracies, or middle powers as you call them, to come together. It came also, I would say, an interesting inflection point for strategic players for strategic watchers in India. Has been 2012 actually, and the Scarborough Shoal sort of crisis. It brought home to Indian policymakers, I would say, the imperative for India to take a more proactive is the wrong word, but a more enthusiastic view of Indo-Pacific. And I would say that it's post 2016, we have seen a much sharper interest in Indo-Pacific. The re-emergence of the Quad, for instance, at the senior officials level, has been I think, has been a turning point in putting the idea of the Indo-Pacific together. But India, for instance, has been very, I'd say, anxious to not equate the Quad with the Indo-Pacific, that the Indo-Pacific is a bigger concept and a bigger idea than merely the Quad. And I think that was intended to maybe not to reassure China and Russia. And I think we must not forget here that it's not just China that opposes the Indo-Pacific. Russia has been a very vocal opponent to the idea of the Indo-Pacific. In fact, when the idea of the Indo-Pacific came about for the second time, in its second iteration, I think the Indian Foreign Office were surprised to receive démarches from Moscow, much more than from Beijing. So that tells you a little bit. And in fact, if you followed Lavrov at Raisina, he was very clear that there is nothing called the Indo-Pacific. It is the Asia-Pacific, and that is what it will remain. And this, despite the fact that last year, when Prime Minister Modi was in Vladivostok, the India and Russia opened a maritime route between Vladivostok and Chennai. And if that isn't an Indo-Pacific maritime route, tell me what is.
Well, the route that the Russian Navy took in 1905 was also quite Pacific, yes.
So yes, so I think that, so the idea, the churn in the idea continues. My personal view is we have been much slower to put the idea of Indo-Pacific together, largely because most of the participants of the Indo-Pacific idea have been taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, hoping not to anger China, not to upset China, or worried about whether somebody else is too close to China, not too close to China. And I think that we've wasted some time on that. My sense is COVID brought it all together in a sort of a weird way, because I just see in the last 1 month a sort of a configuration which I call the Quad Plus, and nobody else calls it the Quad Plus. But I mean, I was writing the story and I didn't know how to describe it, so that's how I described it, which is India, US, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand. 7, I mean, the Quad, of course, we knew, but 3 other interesting countries. And so I've had people asking me, why not Indonesia and why not Singapore? But I think we should watch this particular grouping quite carefully to see whether we can put concrete ideas or concrete projects or concrete outcomes on the ground. And that would make it easier for other countries to actually buy into the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific. My sense is that over the past couple of years, the idea has slowly gained acceptance. The ASEAN, as you mentioned in your book, the ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook was something that we were all quite enthused by and sort of encouraged by. I'm not sure the Chinese took such a enthusiastic view or such an encouraging view of it. We all talk about a post-COVID world now, and I don't know what the post-COVID world would be, but I do believe that the title of your book will probably become more true than ever before, because I do think there are questions being asked, and these are questions that are being asked politically by commentators, by scientists, what have you. But the questions are ultimately come down to one kind of a question, which is what kind of a power is China becoming? And as we put answers to that particular question, I think we will see a sharper contours of the Indo-Pacific policies of all these countries coming together in the coming days. So I'll stop here and maybe we can take it forward in the questions. But a great book, Rory, if I may compliment you on the book. And let me endorse what Harsh said, that it's actually a great read. And you've quoted people who normally don't get quoted in books on strategy. So that was actually even more interesting for me. Compliments for the book, and I'm hoping it will be a bestseller in India as well.
Thank you very much, Indrani. We'll see what we can do.
Sure.
Thank you, Indrani. And Rory, can I invite you to address this question of COVID-19 and its consequences? Indrani has raised it. A number of our viewers are raising it in the Q&A. And as to how you see the consequences playing out, how you see China's role emerging post this, and of course the question of the whole leadership vacuum that we have seen both from European Union, we have seen it from America also. So this is a situation which is still evolving, but I think a lot of our viewers would like to hear from you, especially in the context of what it does to Indo-Pacific, to the concept and this idea of Indo-Pacific.
Thanks. No, thanks, Harsh, and look, thanks, Indrani, for your perceptive thoughts. I mean, I'd like to come back on a few of those later on, including the Russia thing, which intrigues me a bit, and I think it is a bit ironic, given that Russia plays with the whole idea of a Eurasian pan-region when it suits itself. But look, I'll jump straight into the COVID thing, if you like, Harsh. I mean, I'm actually quite reluctant to make big calls on what a post-COVID world's going to look like. I think we're all dealing with a strategic shock. It's as much a domestic political shock as anything else. It's all about human welfare and government legitimacy apart from anything else. And I also think there's a temptation for everyone at the moment to fly into print with their 1,000-word prediction of a post-COVID world. So I'm cautious about that. What I do think is that no major player is likely to cover itself in glory on this issue, and there have been some thoughtful points made about that in some of the writings I've seen, and I agree with that. I think the idea that because Donald Trump is doing such a bad job, if you like, of a concerted, trusted, evidence-based approach to America's response, that does not mean that China is now going to have everything its own way. And I think once again, we face, as I think one of the chapters of the book, I think there's a chapter towards the end of the book where I look at the battle lines of the contest for the Indo-Pacific, but I look quite heavily at the narrative battle. We've got to remember that China invests hugely, $10 billion a year, perhaps, in its soft and sharp power campaigns, its campaigns to influence public and elite opinion around the world. And it's in overdrive now in that campaign to bury the history of the real origins, if you like, of this disaster internally in China, to project a model of Chinese stability and power and even generosity. What I think has changed is that even as many other countries are stumbling, and I think a lot is going to depend on how India handles the next 12 to 18 months. And I think it is going to be tough. It'll be very interesting to hear what others say on that. Indonesia is in for a really hard time. Japan has done reasonably well so far. We just don't know yet how it will play out in Japan. A lot of the countries that are likely to emerge, not unscathed, no one will be unscathed, but in an almost advantageous position in this post-COVID world, are probably going to be relatively small or middle-sized countries that have managed to match their interests and their capabilities and to mobilize their populations. So, Vietnam so far has done a good job. Republic of Korea seems to have turned things around. Australia's doing reasonably well at the moment. Let's see. Taiwan, whether we can or can't call Taiwan a country in this conversation, has done an extraordinary job. So I think there will actually be quite a few islands of stability in the future Indo-Pacific as we all pick up the pieces a year or two from now. And more importantly, even if the United States continues to struggle and to stumble, two really fundamental things have happened as a result of COVID. And I think Indrani's made that point. One is there are quite frantic convergences of interest, solidarity among all sorts of countries that haven't necessarily done a lot together in the past. And that's an essential building block of the multipolarity that the book talks about. And secondly, the really bad taste, if you think, that is left behind of mistrust towards the People's Republic of China. Even if China has improved its ability to stem the spread of the virus internally, even if China is giving some aid to some countries, there is a great wariness now, I think, really almost universally. I mean, look at the way Africa has been alienated in the past 48 hours by China. Look at the way Thailand has been alienated. Look at the way Britain, I think, is being alienated. There's going to be a great wariness. So even if China emerges from this as still very substantially powerful and even wealthy, I think it's going to find the battle for hearts and minds tougher than ever. And so these building blocks give the power centers of a multipolar Indo-Pacific much to work with in setting those limits to China. But as I said, I think a lot is going to depend on how things play out internally in our own countries going forward.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. And there is another question about which perhaps maybe you want to talk about, because we are now looking at competing geographies also. So Indo-Pacific, the maritime space, and the continental landmass, the Eurasian context. And so when you look at the mental maps emerging in the near future, there is a lot of debate about how these two will interact with each other. And the Russia question has already been raised, which is partly the Eurasian question of our times. So clearly there is some juxtaposition between these two mental maps happening. And so how do you read that? Because in the book, you discuss it in peripheral terms. It's because it's not the core of your argument. So I think it would be worth spending some time on the other part of this of the evolution of the global order at this point.
Look, sure. And I think, this whole conversation about mental maps in the end, about definitions of regions and so on, it really matters only in the end in terms of how it comes to bring a bearing on power and on power relations and on the decisions that nations make. But it does have a powerful effect. So if you think, for example, of the way China has sought to define Asia in recent years, bizarre definitions where somehow Egypt is a part of Asia, but Indonesia isn't. We've seen, organisations like that China has hosted, arguing Asia for the Asians. So there is going to be an artificiality to some extent about the way governments play with their mental maps. But I do make the argument, and I would stand by that there is a certain integrity to the Indo-Pacific because of the emphasis on maritime connectivity, the advantages that accrue to maritime trade, even in this era now where trade is obviously being so disrupted and interrupted. The sheer economics of it, the fact that it is going to be permanently cheaper to ship goods by sea in bulk than it is by land. And if you're going to be exporting goods, sort of small amounts of high value goods, you might as well go by air. I think the economics of the Belt and Road, particularly the overland, the Eurasian element of the Belt and Road, are still, I think, slightly unreal. And I think that over time, the economics of the maritime is likely to prevail in terms of cost. The advantages that maritime powers have in the way that they deploy or don't deploy military force is likely to continue to prevail as well. You can deploy your navy without necessarily being threatening in a way that you simply cannot do with land forces. So I think there are some certain arguments that suggest that the sea will outweigh the land, but I don't discount the Eurasia thing. I would argue that the continental connectivity that not only China is building, but that others are seeking to build. And don't forget that others invest, others build infrastructure. Japan is still part of this game, particularly. This continental and land connectivity matters the most where it connects with the sea. And that goes back to the focus on seaports, the focus on port infrastructure. And that's been the case throughout history. It's the case now. So I think in a sense you can discount the centrality of Eurasia by acknowledging its importance insofar as it connects to the sea.
Thank you. There is one question, Rory, which has dogged this conversation, of Indo-Pacific definitions. Where does it begin? Where does it end? Which countries are, sort of focusing on which areas? And one of the questions that we have got is a very interesting one, is that where do you see and how do you locate the Arabian Sea in this context? Because for different countries, there is the Arabian Sea, West Asia, Middle East, whatever you might want to call it, has different levels of importance and different ways of approaching the region. So how, when you look at this idea of Indo-Pacific conceptually, where does the Middle East fit in? Sure. And whether, organically from your definitions, it becomes part of it, or like Americans, you have to do a bit of juggling in terms of coming to terms with the convergence between the two areas.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, these mental maps have often been reinterpreted throughout history, and I would not want to be doctrinaire or rigid about it. And I don't think we have to be, because the beauty of the Indo-Pacific is it is a maritime region, and a maritime region is by definition fluid. So I adopt the, I guess, sort of a mandala, if you like, a mandala model of the region, where I say that the core matters, and the core of the Indo-Pacific, I think, is it's the sea lanes of Southeast Asia, and that's always been the core. If you look at, if you go back to the Chola Empire and Srivijaya and China's early efforts to build influence, if you look at the Portuguese and the Europeans and their attempts to dominate the region, it was always around those straits in Southeast Asia. So I think that's the heart of the Indo-Pacific, and that's incidentally one reason why the South China Sea is everyone's business. But as for the edges, the periphery, I don't think we have to draw a permanent solid line in the middle of the water somewhere in the Indian Ocean or somewhere in the Eastern Pacific and say that Madagascar is in and the Marshall Islands are out, or vice versa. Instead, I think the way that you define the region is about the intersecting interests and connectivity and contestation among the big powers. And so if you look at the key powers in the region, and I would argue the US, China, I would say India and Japan are up there. Russia, we can debate about. Perhaps if Indonesia gets its act together one day, it may be a major power. But even if you look at those four, the US, China, Japan, and India, where do their interests intersect, and where do their interests potentially converge, cooperate, or clash in the region? So when an issue occurs in the Middle East or in the Gulf or in Africa, and that issue relates to the interests and potentially the conflict among those powers, then that is an Indo-Pacific issue. When an issue occurs in one of those sub-regions that has very little to do with the interests of the major powers, then that really is that sub-region's business. That's the way that I try to square that circle. Others may see it differently, and these boundaries may shift throughout history. I mean, as one argues, the European definitions of Asia used to begin somewhere between between I think it was Vienna and Budapest. So mental maps do shift over time.
May I interject?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you said that, and I do agree with you about the core being maritime. And I think you're absolutely right that people are beginning to find out that it is cheaper to go by sea than across expensive train lines across the Eurasian landmass. So that's one. However, if I may expand or sort of look at the core of the Indo-Pacific from the Indian perspective, I would actually put the core in the Indian Ocean, because I think if you look at the transport links, you'd find that more traffic crosses the Indian Ocean than almost anywhere else. It is a strategic space that obviously it is vital to India, but it is a strategic space that becomes very important to both India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and resident powers of the US, France, Japan, if you will. But what it also does, if you look at the map, it includes at least a part of what we call West Asia, because that is, if you look at it from the Indian perspective, that is actually a very big part of our strategic matrix. So if you include, and I know Vajpayee used to say this, that India's neighborhood extends from the Gulf of Aden to the Straits of Malacca. But I think we've expanded it further eastwards, but I don't think we've given up the Gulf of Aden bit. So I think what you do see is a sort of emphasis on the eastern seaboard of Africa, the Gulf states, from the UAE, etc. Not so much the Levant, but definitely the Gulf. And I think that's I would say that may be an acknowledgement the US is making, because I noticed that when Harry Harris used to come for the Raisina, he used to talk about the Hollywood to Bollywood space that the Indo-Pacific occupied. This year, I noticed a different formulation. It said California, Matt Pottinger said California to Kilimanjaro. So, which seemed to me that there is an encompassing of geography that takes that puts the core maybe slightly more westwards from the South China Sea and the Southeast Asia. Now, the question that this raises is: have we then given up on the South China Sea, or are we reducing our interest in the South China Sea? I do not have an answer to that question, but I'm happy if somebody else attempts an answer to the question. Rory, it's back to you.
Thanks. Just a quick response, Harsh, if I may. I mean, I don't disagree with that, Indrani. I think interestingly, and if I had the time, I'd quickly jump back to one of these maps, this Chinese map that is very much, much, I guess, my favorite in the book, because it betrays a whole China-centric worldview that I think a lot of us hadn't appreciated, and that is the centrality of the Indian Ocean to China's view of the strategic and economic system it wants to dominate. And even if you assume that this map looks several decades into the future at China's ambitions, the centrality of the Antarctic as well. So look, I think going back into history, Southeast Asia and coastal India were essentially one combined economic and strategic system. And so perhaps to reconcile those two views about where the heart of this game is, it really is in that shared space. And that's another reason why I think the more that India can engage with Indonesia and maritime Southeast Asia, the better, because all of those East Asian powers are shore playing in the Indian Ocean as well.
Thank you both. We have, I think, a few minutes left with us. And Rory, one question that I think has been coming to us from various quarters, from various viewers, listeners, is this, because your book is essentially about middle powers at the end of the day, and what role can they play in making this mental mapping possible and in reimagining their respective geographies. And I think a lot of questions are about their capacities, their aspirations, and at the end of the day, their ability to work together in a coordinated manner. So even, for example, the idea of Quad, if you take, a number of our viewers have raised this issue as to what is the future of Quad. Do you see that the willingness amongst the various actors to negotiate amongst themselves, the fact that they don't have the same kinds of capabilities, and that it will take some time to develop the kind of the capabilities in line with their aspirations? So I think all those questions are about the ability essentially of the middle powers to manage this transition and to allow their agency to emerge as the stronger one, and their ability to shape, thereby making their ability to shape the regional order much more profound. So anything, I think the last few minutes that you have, if you can actually go back to the core of your argument.
Sure. No, look, that's important. And I deliberately use the term middle players in the book as often as I can, because middle powers, and which I sometimes use, but middle powers is a somewhat controversial term if you apply it, let's say, to India or indeed Japan, both of which qualify in some ways at least to be major powers. And it's interesting, our former foreign minister in Australia, Julie Bishop, used to get upset with the idea that Australia was called a middle power when she noted that we were actually number 13 or 14 in the world for economy and defence spending. So in a sense, we're a top 20 country, as she called us, not a middle power. So I say middle players simply to define those countries that are neither China nor the United States, because one of the motivations for the book is not only to provide, I think, a bit of a corrective to the China-centric view of regional history, or a corrective to the idea that the Indo-Pacific is just something that somebody simply made up, and that somehow the Asia-Pacific is a natural definition of the region, which I think is simply not true. But also I was seeking to address the false binary, if you like, of for example, an Australian colleague, Hugh White, or a number of other commentators who simply say that in the end, everything boils down to the choices of the US and China, and basically the rest of us can do nothing about it except get out of the way. So middle players, what can we do? There was a paper that I wrote some years ago with a very good Indian colleague and friend, Raja Mohan, who I'm sure all of your viewers here know well. And in fact, his own work, I think, has been very inspirational in this book, where we talked about middle power or middle player coalitions, what they could do, how they could arise. And I think we need to be realistic about those coalitions. I don't think that tomorrow Australia and India, or India and Japan, would turn around and necessarily be willing to go to war on one another's behalf if the United States wasn't in the picture. But if we take a long view, and if we look at the steps we need to take in building solidarity and common interest among these powers, there's a lot we can achieve to, I think, change the calculus, change the calculations for China in particular. And that works at a few levels. One is, as middle players individually do their thing to set boundaries to Chinese power and influence, the other middle players notice and tend to almost develop, whether it's through imitation or whether it's through a sort of a stiffening of the spine, develop their own capacity, their own willingness to act together. If you look at the way Japan pushed back against China in the East China Sea, if you look at India's experience with Doklam, if you look at Australia's experience with cracking down on Chinese political interference inside this country, which was a very difficult set of steps to take. In each case, we've grown somewhat emboldened by one another's behaviour, and I think it makes it a little bit easier to form coalitions to push back in the future. So there's an incrementalism there. The last 2 points I'd make, if I may, Harsh, one is that we shouldn't pretend or imagine this is all about the Quad. I support the Quad. I think the Quad has a certain natural realism to it. We have to remember it arose originally from disaster relief in 2004 after the tsunami. So the idea that the Quad now evolves as a result of another, essentially, shall we say, natural disaster, if we can call a pandemic that, or a transnational issue at least, I think has a certain logic and symmetry to it. But one of the greatest achievements of the Quad is that it has made the world safe for trilateralism, and it's made the world safe for a stronger web of bilateral arrangements among countries like Australia, India, Japan, France, Vietnam, a whole range of countries that are not necessarily going to be allies in a formal sense tomorrow, but all have an interest in setting limits to Chinese power and making multipolarity work. And so while China has been distracted by the lightning rod of the Quad, the rest of us have got up with building these other relationships, which over time, I think, will set limits to the way China uses its power. And finally, and COVID offers an obvious counter or caveat to this, because we simply don't know how COVID is going to affect all of our economies and societies over, let's say, the next 20 years. But if you do take a long view and take a generational view, which the book does, and the book projects plausible futures forward to the 2040s, the middle players are not necessarily so middle-sized after all. The book looks at possible projections for India, Indonesia, Japan, for example, and puts them alongside China and says, well, the aggregate of these three powers could potentially be the same or larger than the PRC in GDP, in military spending, in population already is. Now, COVID may offer a pretty major blow to that projection. We just don't know. But equally, we don't know how stable or brittle China is going to be by the 2040s when it's dealing with its massive internal problems, aging demographic, potential political dissent, debt, environmental crisis, and so forth. I certainly wouldn't be giving up on the middle players yet.
Thank you. I think we have almost reached the end of our time. In fact, we have, we have done more than what we had initially desired. And I think, thank you, Rory, for being with us. And this is your first book launch in India, virtually, though it might be.
It is, and I look forward to more virtual ones, but also a real, perhaps, retrospective book launch in time when I get back to Delhi, one of my favourite towns.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you once things settle down in person. Thank you, Indrani, for being here with us today, and thank you all for joining us with your questions, comments, which I know there were many more which we could have talked about, till cows come home. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Rory and Indrani, once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Indrani. Thanks again.
Thank you, Rory.